pause, silence. Let's reconvene in person again, to reconnect, to tell our stories, to listen, to disarm ourselves of preconceived notions, to reframe, to reflect, to unplug. Welcome to hashtag Unplugged22. Take a victory lap. High five a friend. This is your moment, our moment. Together, we unplug to connect again and remember why we started. Let's evaluate our community and our digital impact with quality conversations rooted in context. We're about real connections that translate into real-life action. Brought to you by Jam Lab Africa and the Civic Tech Innovation Network.
Hi everyone, I hope you can hear me. I hope my mic is okay. Welcome to the Civic Tech Innovation Forum, co-hosted with Jamfest. Thank you for joining us for this year's forum, which has the theme Unplugged but Still Connecting. My name is Halfdan Lynge. I'm a senior lecturer at the Wits School of Governance in South Africa, and I'm also a reference group member of something called the Civic Tech Innovation Network. I'll be facilitating the panel discussion this morning entitled North, South, East, West, Civic Tech Innovators Roundtable. So this roundtable is a space for the African civic tech innovators to explore the current civic tech space and share new directions for the future. Given the changing funding landscape, civic innovators must consider the implications and the future of the civic tech ecosystem. The session invites regional perspectives on the future of African civic tech, and it's an opportunity for the community to share experiences and explore key trends, challenges, and opportunities. Before we get started, just a few basic housekeeping rules. So there is a chat function on this platform. If you want to post a comment or you want to share your thoughts on some of the things that our panelists will be telling this morning. If you want to ask a question to me or the panelists, please use the Q&A function, which you will also find on the platform. And finally, there's a raise hand function if you would like to speak. And also, if you can, please share and tweet today's conversation on social media using the hashtag CTIF22 and hashtag unplugged. So we are really hoping to make this session interactive. So please use the chat and the Q&A functions to keep the discussion going. And just to be sure you're aware, the discussion is being recorded and will be made publicly available on various platforms after this session. So we have a brilliant panel of discussants lined up for you today. We have Gabriela Razzano, who is the founding director of Open Up South Africa and also a research fellow with Research ICT Africa and an Atlantic Senior Fellow in Social and Economic Equity. Then we have Rebecca Chow, who is a co-founder and the chair of the board of directors of HarassMap. And then we have Nelson Olanipekun, who is the team lead of Citizens Gavel in Nigeria. And we have Caroline Gyathi, who is a deputy program officer for communications for the public accountability thematic area at Transparency International Kenya. So the plan for the session this morning is as follows. First, I'll give the panelists an opportunity to deliver their 5-minute opening remarks. Next, we've allocated about 30 minutes for an interaction and exchange, a discussion between the different discussants. And finally, I will open up for questions and comments from the virtual floor. We also have allocated around 30 minutes for that, but let's see how it plays out. The plan is to end the session at 11:30 CAT. Now, I'll allow the panelists to speak in the order they appear on the little note that was given to me. And that means that Gabriela Razzano will be the first speaker. Gabriela, the floor is yours.
Sure. Okay, thanks. I'll be brief. I just wanted to introduce some of the main developments or issues I see on funding from a South African perspective, and hopefully, but I see it's obviously relevant to Southern Africa and the region more broadly. I think the civic tech community has been largely reliant on different kinds of grant funding for a long time. So you have the development funders who are, but tend to be very administratively heavy. And of course, that comes from the fact that those funds are considered, essentially taxed or citizen funds. Then you have the philanthropies, and within the philanthropies, you have some more technology savvy philanthropy organizations like your Luminates and DG Murray Trust and Indigo Trust. But a lot of those the majority of philanthropies don't center innovation, or at least don't necessarily have a good understanding of innovation processes. But there are emerging opportunities in terms of private sector corporate social responsibility funds, although particularly for the civic tech community, those kinds of funds tend to be allocated towards, the kinds of organizations which have a very demonstrable impact, on the ground impact. And a lot of that has to do with how those funds, consider a return on investment to look like. So they'll, you build 6 homes for, 8 families, and that kind of understanding, or not limited understanding of impact, but very direct understanding of impact, has a strong influence on how I'm trying to access those funds. In terms of some of the trends, there's obviously been shrinking funding pools available for a long time. For South Africa in particular, especially as it's become to be considered more of a middle income country, I think there's been definitely over the last 8 years, steady shrinking of funds available. And I think, the solution to a lot of these challenges is to look at diversified streams of funding. So as an organization, we get development funds, but we also get philanthropic funds. We also get funds from private sector partnerships, and from government partnerships, which continues to be actually quite a strong source of funds for my organization. I think is quite unusual in the innovation space, but particularly given government, the lack of internal capacity for government in the region on technology innovation, I think it is an emerging strong opportunity for collaboration in terms of funds. But one thing I wanted to flag in my opening, and then I'll close, sorry, I've already been too long, is something that does increasingly concern me, with increasingly of interest, is how I think you have to place the civic tech innovation community within the startup and innovation community. I think, there is a need not just to develop civic tech, but the African capacity for innovation more generally, in order to, participate more actively in digital and data economies. And so something that concerns me, or is the increasing reliance or emergence of the sort of development agenda in driving civic tech, which means that a lot of emerging social entrepreneurships always tend to think of themselves as non-profit entities, because they start out in hackathons sponsored by the Gates Foundation, or in hackathons sponsored by the World Bank. And I think if we want to create a sustainable technology ecosystem in the continent, we have to realize the kinds of funds that are needed to do that. And it worries me that, there is a trend for social entrepreneurships to immediately presume that a non-profit model is one that will definitely work for them, because I think there are limits to the kind of scaling a technology organization can do on those funds. And it actually creates a form of dependency that I'm not sure in the long term is going to be fully beneficial for the ecosystem more broadly. So those are my open comments.
Thanks a lot, Gabriela. Very, very interesting comments. I took note of a lot of things. You saw me typing away here. Very interesting points about developing, diversifying funding, developing partnership with private sector, government. You mentioned government capacity shortages, and you saw it as an opportunity. That's something we will definitely pick up on later in the conversation. And you spoke about creating a sustainable civic tech ecosystem and thinking outside of perhaps I could paraphrase and call it nonprofit rationale. So really interesting insights. Thank you so much. I will now hand over to the next speaker, which is Rebecca Chow.
Hi, thank you so much. And thank you to the Civic Tech Innovation Network for thinking of HarassMap and inviting us to participate. It's such an important discussion. We're really glad to be a part of it. So I'm Rebecca Chow, and my friend Inji and I started HarassMap in 2010 in Egypt as a way to re-engage a broad public social movement against sexual harassment and assault in Egypt. And we started, when we started HarassMap, we have gone through a lot of changes and adaptations to survive. So when we began, in 2010, we were an unfunded small handful of volunteers doing whatever we could to kind of integrate technological tools like crowd mapping together with on-the-ground community-based work to kind of create a broad and inclusive movement that was nationwide and changes social norms, and also like concrete on the ground actions like creating zero tolerance safe areas. And we used a different kind of legal structure and different funding structures to adapt to all the changes that have happened since then. We had a revolution about a month after we launched. And since then, we had about 5 different political systems. And so that means different sets of laws, different sets of like relationships between the government and organizations, activists, the public in general, and of course the main way this is expressed is through regulations with funding. So when we were self-funded volunteers, we had a lot of freedom and flexibility, which we loved, but that we weren't able to continue that with with a lot of impact and consistency over the years. So we ran unfunded for about 2 years, and then we chose a few foundations to partner with for grants. It was just a small amount of funding, but it gave us a staff, and this was really important for our sustainability and our ability to make like actual change on the ground and be consistent with our work. As the laws changed, we registered as an NGO, and we started integrating more grants from foundations, but also balancing them with income generation to make a more sustainable, or what we thought would be a more sustainable resource base. So we started charging some partners who could afford it fees for services. So companies, for example, Uber is one of our partners, and they were able to cover the cost of some of the work we did together. However, since 2020, a combination of legal changes and just the funding environment in general has put us in a situation where, for the first time since 2010, we really fear that we might have to shut down because of lack of resources. So several donors, after COVID started, canceled contracts that they had with us. This includes private foundations and mostly the income generation, actually. So almost all the income generation, um, just our partners decided they didn't have the budget for this, and in-person work was cut off, and a lot of things that we had previously counted on weren't there anymore. So we suddenly had a plan that had no funding anymore, and this included new relationships and long-term relationships. Right now we're down to one donor, and we made a lot of internal changes to try to extend how long we can survive with this situation. We gave up our office, for example, and we went from a full-time team of about 27 to a team with only 2 full-time and 2 part-time staff. This has a lot of consequences because our capacity is less. We have to spend a higher percentage of our time on fundraising and trying to develop new relationships with possible donors and possible partners that do have funds these days. And this is a frustrating situation for us because we're used to taking like covering our kind of basic operations, our staff and our office, and all the necessities with grants, and then just doing as much work as we possibly can. So we're used to working unfunded, but there's a basic level of like staff and capacity that we do need funding for. So right now we're able to predict being operational until about May in 2023, and then after that we're not sure. So we're working really hard to restructure our funding base and our resource base, but it is taking a lot of time and effort, and we're worried for ourselves, of course, but in the bigger picture, what this means is worse, because in Egypt, with the sexual harassment movement, Harassmap has been one of the main, possibly the main actor that kind of keeps the public and other activists and other organizations focused on this issue for the last decade. And the reason that we started was actually because there was a lag in public engagement. For a couple of years, the organizations that were working on sexual harassment and assault focused on legal advocacy instead of the public engagement, and so much was lost. The public is really what drives the change on the issue, and so we're really afraid that with this environment, this funding environment, not supporting many organizations like Harassmap and our colleagues, that the public momentum is going to be lost again, and all of the ground that we gained over the last decade is going to disappear. So that's my introduction, my opening remarks, and I'm really excited to hear strategies from the other organizations and from the audience, and hopefully we can learn from your experiences as well, and work together to recover from the last couple of years. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rebecca. Really, thanks for sharing your personal journey and experiences with navigating what sounds like a very volatile political system, and constantly having to be creative about funding and be innovative to sustain the important work that you're doing. So I'm sure we'll also come back and perhaps discuss some of the differences and what it's like working in your political environment as opposed to some other countries. So thanks a lot for that. The next speaker is Nelson Olanipekon. Nelson, please, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone, and nice to meet you. I can basically relate to majority of the stories and perspectives that have been shared so far. So mine will not be quite different, but something similar. Of course. So Gavel, it basically works in the area of access to justice to accelerate the pace of justice delivery through digital technology, access to justice, and citizens' engagement. When we started a couple of years back, of course, it was self-funded and it was used to drive. Um, it was started after an incubation section led by Budget, one of the leading foundations in Nigeria. And after a year after the funding, we were able to access our first grant, which since then we've been moving between 2-3 donors and thereabout. But for some time now, our donor landscape has just been either one or the other. So we are moving in between donors. So before now, we probably have funding from 2-3 donors running simultaneously, and now you just have one funders, or at best probably two funders, and but oftentimes it's one fund. And one I've noticed is that we need to be intentional about how we ensure sustainability of the organization. So that led me to try out new other initiatives within the organization that could ensure sustainability. Number one was, how can we save better? How can we put some funds aside and save them? Number two, how can we use our internal resources to generate um, a bit of revenue? So in terms of how can we save better, we're looking at, okay, so how can we from our running costs, from some of the how can we cut down on those things and save some of these funds in for rainy days? And the other one, which was to use our resources. So we're now leveraging on our digital resources to somewhat generate revenue. So I've been able to position our tech unit to work with other non-profit organizations to provide them services, and we can now generate revenue through that channel. So if other non-profit organizations would like to build digital platform apps or any digital products, we are gradually positioning ourselves in that space where we become the go-to person. And why we are better than others is because for others, they are basically private organizations that are looking at generating profit, making their board members happy, and the likes. Whereas for us, we are more of, once we get this revenue in through the services we get and we provide, we use those revenues to apply it back into the non-profit activities that we run, the free access to lawyers, the sexual and gender-based violence project that we are engaged in, and different other products and projects that we are engaged in. And so that has really helped us in, of course, gradually opening another stream of income. It's not a major stream like we would have loved. It's probably $10,000, $15,000 an hour. At the moment, we run far more uh, with a lot of money than that. But of course, opening that up gives us that sustainability pipeline. Beyond that, also, we're also opening up how can we generate within the um, objective, within our objective, within the goals of the organization. How can we look at ways through which we could develop maybe apps, products that could accelerate the pace of justice delivery, but that people can pay for as well. So once people pay for that, we are able to use those funds to also support the non-paid for aspect. So those are some of the ways and tricks that we've been using to ensure that once donor attention shifts, which often happens, we can still stay afloat, even though we might not be running at 100%, but we're still running. Because over years, it's obvious that attention of donors shifts. It could be thematic in the area of thematic areas. It could be in the area of even totally regionally. So moving from one region to another region, and so with all this put in place, one has to be must be sustainable and try not to rely on um, focusing on these donors. And that has even led to us opening other opportunities and branches. We tried to open a UK office to see how we could be more open to the world rather than just operating from Nigeria. With opening to the UK office, we could get some of our digital services that we just opened up. We could get funding through that channel and use that to support our African initiative. And with all those, with when one of the beautiful things is that because some of these major currency have this they have a powerful conversion. So by the time you convert them to your local currency, it's something a little bit relatively significant, and it helps to at least run a bit than you just working within your local context. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nelson. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on this and some concrete examples of how organizations are perhaps increasingly developing products and services that can be sold commercially as a way of generating revenue and subsidizing non-profit activities. Um, I did pick up that you were saying you were trying to open a UK office to be open to the world, and I thought to myself, perhaps the UK, with everything that's happening there right now, is not the right place to open up to the world. But that's a discussion for another time. So thanks a lot, Nelson. We now have the last speaker, Caroline Gyathi. Please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Hafnan, and everyone else who has spoken. I'll try and keep it brief, not to repeat what everyone, my colleagues have discussed about. Yes, I work for Transparency International Kenya, and we do leverage a lot on the use of digital platforms because our core mandate is fighting corruption, and this has included incorporating ICT in our work to champion that fight and promoting.
Sorry, Caroline, to interrupt you. There's your connection is not too good. So if you could just speak up a little bit, I think we'll be able to hear you.
Okay.
There's a lot of interference there, but I think if you speak up, it should be fine.
Let me try and switch into just a moment.
It doesn't sound like an internet issue. I think it sounds like static interference. But anyway, I didn't want to interrupt you, so please go ahead. If you could just speak up a little bit, I think we'll be fine. Thank you.
Is this better now?
Yeah, we get the interference still there, but it's fine. We can hear you. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. So I was saying that we use digital platforms to help us in the fight against corruption and also to promote accountability at all levels. And some of the we've created, we actually have over 10 online platforms that are currently being used for this purpose. And the specific one I would like to highlight is called the Media Tech Hub, which is an innovative space for positive social change and uses all form of media. It brings about software developers, journalists, and also citizens at large, whereby they are able to brainstorm and develop innovative solutions to address the gaps in the society and also to achieve effective reporting of accountability issues in service delivery. Um, some of the opportunities we've had is actually in terms of funding is we've done a lot of seed funding, and that is how I've come to see it being successful in running these projects. We've done different projects in partnership with, for example, Magamba Network, who are based in Zimbabwe. Here we've used a lot of combination of investigative journalism and creatives um, for advocacy purposes. And also we've had a partnership with Foyo Media Institute and also under the Swedish Institute funds. These ones have helped us a lot on holding different kind of datathons, for example, whereby the datathons have addressed different issues, especially during the COVID-19 period. We had two datathons in Africa that addressed on COVID-19 accountability. The other challenge we have experienced here in Kenya, I would say, is I think it's Africa at large is on the access to information laws. There's a lot of interruption when it comes to e-governance and access to information because the citizens are not able to whistleblow on corruption issues using these e-platforms due to risks, I would say, due to threats that they are receiving. So that is one of the major challenges on whistleblowing. And also, I would also say that the platforms that we have created have also helped to tackle disinformation on the other hand, which I think it's a plus. And we have worked very closely with Africa Check on this one, especially on matters on, we recently had elections and there was so much propaganda going on in terms of elections. And the platforms that we had in partnership with, in collaboration, sorry, with Africa Check helped us to share the right information to the citizens. And I think these are opportunities that we need to explore as different organizations here in Africa. If we work together, we are able to seek better funding opportunities, and also to leverage on different platforms, of course, with the different objectives that they offer. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Caroline. I hope participants could hear your inputs. I know that the sound wasn't too bad, and I could see some comments in the chat, so I do apologize for that. I certainly picked it up, and just to summarize, perhaps Caroline was given a description of some of the work they're doing in Kenya around digital platforms to fight corruption and promote accountability. She mentioned a couple of specific platforms, especially something, and I think I got the name right, the Media Tech Hub, which is a hub for software developers, journalists, and citizens to collaborate around innovation to improve service delivery. Then perhaps one thing I think was quite important here is so Caroline mentioned the difficulty in using access to information laws, that some citizens do not use or cannot use different platforms due to fear, and then fear of actually exposing corruption. And then finally, she spoke about the elections, the recently completed elections in Kenya, where a lot of propaganda was circulating and misinformation happened, and how how they contributed to sharing validated information. Good. So thank you all for your sort of opening remarks. There's a couple of things I picked up on, but perhaps to start, I did note that out of the 4 speakers, 3 spoke about the political environment. We had a personal experience. Rebecca shared some personal experiences from Egypt, and Nelson quickly picked up and said, you know, what Rebecca is describing resonates with me. And also, we also heard Caroline speak about the political environment and fear of actually disclosing information. The only person that didn't speak about it is Gabriella. And actually, Gabriella, I'm putting you on the spot here, but I'm actually curious if you could say a little bit about the political or you know, the political climate in South Africa and what it's like to work in this space in South Africa.
Yeah, maybe I'm just so tired of dealing with that I automatically assume everybody, you know, I come in with that trauma on a plate and I just presume you're all perfectly aware that that's how we start. I mean, I think that it's kind of an important founding issue for the civic tech. It's the civic tech community is in such an interesting place because I think there's just so much different kinds. There's so many ways we're not like other civil society organizations, and then there's so many ways that we are. And we certainly have the same legal and political challenges where they exist. So South Africa has had a long history of, you know, in indirect ways trying to shut down civic space. It is not anything compared to the rest of the region. And I fully acknowledge that. And that's, you know, part of the reason why we are able to have such a robust civil society environment. But certainly, you know, there have been a number of legislative attempts to shut down civic space indirectly, generally. I'm thinking about, you know, original drafts on cybercrime legislation, original drafts on what we call the secrecy bill, original drafts. Now, even in the fight against terrorism bill, you know, certain issues that will definitely present challenges to how civil society organizations do or don't get funds. And the difficulty with that is that, you know, as the civic tech community can't think that it stands outside of these broader civil society challenges. And so on top of all the other things we need to do, participating and making sure we're participating in those kinds of advocacy and civil society initiatives is really important to create the kind of ecosystem that we need to be able to work in. But you know, I think South Africa, as much as we complain, is, you know, it's fairly facilitative. You know, so the non-profits registration bureaucratic requirements are quite low, although they, you know, the Department of Social Development, which is meant to oversee those registrations and those kind of thing, is the directorate is barely functioning, which does present challenges to particularly organizations that are less developed. And so I think in South Africa, the biggest challenges are for grassroots organizations, real grassroots organizations, which is another challenge to, I think, civic tech organizations to try and actually also perform the role of intermediary receiving funds to assist those kinds of groups, I think is something to think about in terms of your role. Yeah.
Thanks, Gabriella. I wanna give the other discussants a chance to come in here, but before that, you did mention in your 5-minute opening remarks, you spoke about diversifying funding and developing partnership. You mentioned the private sector, but you specifically mentioned also the government, and you mentioned government capacity shortages as an opportunity to actually kind of like fill the gaps, the capacity gaps within government. If you could just elaborate on that for 1 or 2 minutes, then I want to, yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's quite an unorthodox kind of role, but it's one that's proved quite sustainable for us. It does also depend, in different contexts. What you'd have to look at, for instance, is the existing procurement legislation and procurement requirements, whether there are limitations in terms of how you are organized that might prevent you from participating in those procurement processes or not, as well as potentially competition questions in your region. But outside of those, flags of, if you were a good lawyer, this is what you'd look at. We do have, for instance, Vulika Mali is an open budget portal we have developed in partnership with National Treasury. National Treasury funded the first round of that development. It's now funded the second phase of that development. We've also partnered with local municipalities where they've had sufficient funds to essentially pay us in what looked like we don't call them revenue projects because that confuses our auditors, but essentially income projects with municipalities for products that advance public participation. Of course, given the kind of association we are, but also given our ethical mandate, we have to make very, very sure that those kinds of partnerships are done in a way in which we authentically believe they advance the foundational principles of our organization. But fortunately, so far, that consistently does happen. And I think particularly in this context of where, innovation is seen as a way of forwarding development narratives and development goals, I think there's a lot of synergy with foundations, all right.
Thanks. I want to hand over to Rebecca. Rebecca, I'm sure this sounds like a different planet to you, what Gabriella is sharing from South Africa. But I'm actually curious to hear do you have any kind of dialogue with public entities, government entities, or it's one-way communication? You spoke specifically about regulation of funding and how that's being used, or at one point was being used to suppress civil society and a sort of the civic space. Do you have any engagement with government?
Yes, but it's mixed. So the government does regulate NGOs, and so at one point, I think it was 2014, all the activists and what we called initiatives, like unregistered groups of people, needed to register as NGOs under the ministry, and then the ministry would approve every piece of income, which led to long delays. So that's one relationship. Then the government also has a National Council for Women that sometimes does work on this issue. We don't usually make partnerships directly with them because a lot of times we lose our control over the project. So the National Council for Women has taken over some of our projects and replicated some of our projects, and they've invited us to work with them on them. In our experience in the past, we lose decision-making control and so we can't control the quality of the work anymore. And so we've decided that in general we don't enter into these cooperations, and we just prefer to be independent, because then we can like control the impact, the outcome of what we're doing. We have done several kind of activity oriented partnerships with different governmental agencies, but it's more like we train them or in our project, and it's not as much running the project together. So we trained the Egyptian National Railways on our Safe Areas project, and we worked with the Ministry of Youth once to train a bunch of young people to do work, and the government of Alexandria also. There's small scale short term work, but like a larger partnership, it would be great for us to have. Like, we recognize that the government has an amazing capacity, and it would be great if it worked out. So maybe in the future it would be an option, but so far it's kind of not very productive. Like, you lose control of of what you're doing. And so, for example, just to clarify, that when the National Council for Women took over our anti-harassment program in public universities, they renamed the university units dealing with the issue from anti-sexual harassment units to anti-violence units. So renaming it anti-violence broadens the scope and erases the focus on sexual violence, on sexual harassment and sexual assault. And this is something that we wanted to be able to prevent. We want to keep alive this this movement.
No, thanks for that. I think this idea of broadening scopes and broadening TORs is a classical way of diluting diluting whatever is being done. No, thanks for that, Reka. And I think it's really interesting how even in a very sort of tight political environment, you are able to have some kind of dialogue with some entities, and I think that's an important finding from perhaps this conversation and some other research also, that we tend to think of government as monolithic, but actually it's made of multiple entities, and sometimes it is possible to at the very least have a conversation, even if the sort of broader regime is perhaps not open for sort of any engagement. So thanks for that. Nelson, I want to hand over to you. You did mention in your presentation that you are beginning to diversify, and I think you specifically mentioned servicing other non-governmental organizations and developing solutions, platforms, product services for NGOs working in the digital space. Have you had any engagement with government, or are you mainly focused on NGOs?
Yeah, so of course we've had lots of engagement with government, and one of the things that we're popular in Nigeria for is being part of the NSAS movement in Nigeria, which was a very big and popular movement in Nigeria that's culminated into the government trying to actually banning Twitter in Nigeria for a long time, I think over a year or thereabout, and it was recently restored. So many of our work has a component that has to do with government, but I would like to establish one pattern that I've noticed over time. One thing is that I noticed that government is an extension of personality of the person in power. So how 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 much or how hard they try to go after CSO is an an expansion, is an extension of how open and how receptive the person in power is to criticism and to alternative perspective. So we've had government in place that, of course, were not that hard on CSOs, and we've had government in place, especially the recent government in Nigeria, um, has been pretty hard on CSOs, and that has led to different ways to regulate the CSO. There have been an introduction of the NGO bill, which is more or less like an anti-NGO bill that was meant to regulate the CSO, which the coalition of CSOs in Nigeria pushed against. Because how do you want to regulate a group of organizations that are anti-government and you want to subsume them under a ministry in Nigeria? So they have to approve their budget, approve everything. Definitely, whosoever controls the piper dictates the tune. And in Nigeria, the piper is someone that plays a form of musical instrument. And so whosoever controls no, the NGO would dictate how much being effective they would like them to be. So there have also been anti-social media movement, and an anti-social media bill spearheaded by the government, which is a form of way to gag freedom of speech in Nigeria. Majority of the NGOs use social media a lot to speak out to criticize the government, because using physical space is quite dangerous. The government would send police, would send military to those physical spaces, and would arrest people at will and just incarcerate them. There have been those instances. So people now speak more on social media, where it's at least quite difficult to get that person arrested. And until they have been able to gather a lot of voices on those issues on social media, do they now transform to physical, maybe gathering in form of peaceful protests and the likes. And one of that is the NSAS movement, which was an anti-police brutality movement in Nigeria. So there was this unit of police called SARS, Special Anti-Robbery Squad. It was a form of SWAT, and what they were meant to do is to go after violent crimes. But they were notorious for an extrajudicial killing, police brutality, extortion, and different issues. So the citizen, having tried over the years to manage, handle, and to even voice out against these issues, the government has responded in different forms, but the citizen had enough in 2020, and they came out in large quantities to the streets to protest against that. And that led to another form of military and police intervention, that people were shot at, and people were killed. And and it led to government also trying to cover up those atrocities. But of course, those issues are still before the court and are still within the international um, spaces to be handled. But that shows how government use both legislation, use the military and police, and use media to try to gag citizens. So they use legislation. If they are not successful with legislation, they use police and military. If they are not successful with that, they bring up um, media components through their allies in the media houses to try to refrain, control the conversation in the media, and ensure that they raise an an opposite information contrary to what you see as the truth. So government has their own far reaching. One way that they recently also tried to restrict the activities of CSOs in Nigeria is the new Companies and Allied Matters Act. So the Companies and Allied Matters Act is the legislation that provides for the establishment of companies, organizations, or any form of entity in the country. And the NGO space was, we're not aware, they just thought they wanted to improve the ease of doing business in the country. But whereas they were able to introduce new legislation within that law under the guise of trying to fix the ease of doing business that were restrictive to the NGO space. And now they've not really used those laws or regulations, but we've seen that they were successful in putting those legislations in place. And I will see that later on, maybe after a couple of years, they will try to activate those laws. Because now NGOs in Nigeria try to raise issues against these laws, and they were like, no, that's not what it meant. That's not what it meant. They tried to come up with different interpretations on their own to those laws. But the government was saying, no, we don't intend that. But we know that, like, the Cybercrime Act has been used before to constrain people that were vocal. I see that possibility coming into play in using those laws and this new KAMA law to also restrain voices of vocal NGOs in the country. So there have been multiple and different ways through which government, of course, has tried to restrict activities of non-profit organizations in Nigeria.
Thanks, Nelson. And I presume that also means that actual partnerships and funding support from government is not nothing that you are that you're thinking about in given what you just described.
Yeah.
Caroline.
Okay.
Yeah. Go. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So yes, that is not a play in Nigeria at the moment. You don't see government support to NGO, unlike other countries. Of course, I've been in the UK for a few months now, and I noticed that government actively try to support NGOs that provide some services that are close to what they're doing. So that are some of the lessons learned on how some of these things work. But beyond that, like I said earlier, the way the anti NGO reaction comes to place is more or less an extension of the leadership in power. And it gets to a point where if you identify a right leadership in different local contexts, so for example, it might not be at the federal level, it might be at the state level, it might be the governors. Some governors might appreciate the support of NGOs. So you might be able to partner with those governors or those entities in that context to deliver or do some work together in form of partnership. But in the broad context, yeah, no, thank you.
Thanks, Nelson. I want to open up for questions from the floor just now, but before that, Caroline, I'm curious. So we know that Kenya has a very vibrant tech sector, and certainly from the outside, it appears that there's also quite considerable sort of finance for the tech sector in Kenya. And I'm just curious to hear whether you are collaborating in any way with companies, private sector entities working in this sort of tech space startup community in Kenya?
I'm not sure if I'm audible now. Is it better now?
You're very vague, so if you can speak up, I think we can hear you. It's more the static interference. Yeah.
Is this better?
Yeah, as loud as you can. Thank you.
Okay. Yes. So not per se on the private sector, really. It's what I was trying to explain. The Media Tech platform that we started here in Kenya. So the platform basically collaborates with different software developers and investigative journalists and creatives. And so we are trying to see how to advance that so that it can be used even in different African countries because the platform is able to help different groups to innovate, to share information and resources, and also to help the journalists to do investigative stories using the right kind of data. And one of the things that we are passionate about at the moment is on capacity building for these groups. First, that's our first step. We are working with the different groups to build their capacities in different areas of data analysis, data visualization, and data mining because has been a need for quite some time. So once that has happened, then now the different groups will be able to work together in a co-creation kind of way, so that they can use the different kind of data across different platforms. They can analyze the data. They can, help in sharing information, breaking down information even to citizens that they can be able to access. I had mentioned that access to information here has been quite a challenge, and also the whistleblowing protection bill has not come to a reality here in Kenya. So we're trying to see how these platforms can help different groups to report on corruption and also enhance accountability in service delivery. And that is one of the ways that we are doing that.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Caroline. I see there's a lively discussion in the chat, and we also have a couple of questions. So I want to go and check some of these questions here. Gabriela, we have a question here from Richard from Open Cities Lab. I'm not sure whether we can get our tech support to pull it out and show it on the screen. I know there is a fancy functionality in this platform here. Oh, there it is. Can you see it, Gabriela?
Well, I see a question in there too. There's a question, and then there's Richard also talking about not being a fan of intermediaries.
Oh, okay. No, I was referring to it's something else. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Maybe it's getting too sophisticated, this platform here. No, I was thinking about the first question. Yeah. Do you think the philanthropic NPO slant on Civic Tech also means there is not as much pressure to build users validate use cases in Civic Tech and leading to that's a word I don't know, Civic Tech graveyard? Thank you.
The Civic Tech graveyard. Yeah. I mean, I do definitely think it has a role. At the same time, we need to be very conscious of what impact looks like. So we've developed a tool, for instance, there was a tool I like this tool because it's a classic example. The problem with the purely economic model is what is identified as impact and what is identified as, it's purely economic metrics. So you need, 2 million users, whether you've got a subscription model or an advertising model, you need a vast body of users in order to render any profit or whatever. In a civic tech environment, it's so much more nuanced. Like, so we have the national lotteries tool. The national lotteries tool essentially just it was an easy tool for tracking lotteries payments. Okay, so it was open to everyone, but really it was used by one journalist, Raymond Joseph in South Africa. And really that's kind of who we designed for. And his reporting essentially has absolutely blown the lid wide open on the scale of corruption in the lotteries, the South African Lotteries Board. And I think that's a classic example of how you have to think of impact differently. But I think, understanding impact becomes the answer for many reasons. One, because if you can frame your impact very, very well, it opens up the door on a lot more corporate social responsibility funds, those kinds of audiences where I don't think we've necessarily yet fully explored, what a source of those funds can be. And funny enough, I think it actually has a kind of a historical, it might also be linked more historically to civil society, how civil society has worked in Africa and South Africa rather than how private finances worked. Because if you think about the kinds of large scale organizations in Europe and the States that are essentially charitable organizations, so in other words, have models which are far more based on individual, but mass individual donors in order to become viable, they've become very good at conceptualizing and documenting and selling this idea of impact. And certainly in South Africa, that kind of charity model was never really a model that was followed. There are a couple of service organizations that follow that charity model, and I'm not saying that model works, but I think the lessons that a lot of those organizations learned about framing impact were ones that many of our organizations haven't had. And so, yeah, I think that's where a lot of the solutions lie.
Thanks, Gabriela. I really like that phrase, selling the idea of impact. I think I'm going to steal that from you and use it in the future.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. There's another really, really interesting question from Geshi from CTIN, who's asking, so we obviously in your opening remarks, we heard a lot of sort of different perspectives on or thoughts on what it's like to work in your environment and what the implications are. And I perhaps exposed my bias as a political scientist and immediately started thinking about the different political systems and regimes, etc., etc. But Geshi has an important point here to point on the fact that there are also a size question here, big civic tech organizations as opposed to smaller ones. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, because some of you have actually gone through the full cycle of starting out as little 2 individual initiatives to developing into fairly big organizations. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on whether that also has an impact on how you mobilize funding and where you what potential partners you consider. Perhaps we can start with you, Rebecca. You shared with us your journey.
Yeah, we did change our size quite a bit, and I think to some extent this is true that the funding streams work better. Some funding streams work better at different sizes, and then there are some that are good no matter what, and some that have similar challenges no matter what size you have. So when we were small, the legal environment was also different, the political environment. So we had no government when when we first started, we had a government for a month. But then after that, there was no government. And so there was no regulation that we had to deal with. So it was easy when we wanted to do an activity to just collect money. So the first thing we did, we wanted to train a bunch of volunteers. So we hosted it at my house, and Angie bought some stuff. I bought some stuff. We were really excited when we got our first flip chart. When we wanted to print stickers, we just collected £5 here and there from our friends. And that was an amazing way to work. It was great. There was no bureaucracy, and we could just do whatever we wanted right away. But this changed because then we got a government, and we had laws we had to comply with, and we had to have a staff eventually when we got to a certain size that we paid to come to work, and we had to start having like better accounting systems and file reports and things like this. And this required a different type of fundraising. You can't just go to your friends and ask for 10 pounds here and there to fund an accountant. They're not that excited about it. So then we started to prefer foundation grants more. And our favorite is multi-year core support. And this really helped from when we were small until now. Actually, that doesn't really matter. If your partner has a low level of reporting requirement, or not a very complicated proposal, and you can kind of work together with them easily, and you can develop a good relationship where there's a lot of mutual trust, and not so much bureaucracy. I think that works for all scales. When there's more complicated applications and more complicated reporting, it's harder when you're smaller. And working with private sector partners is something we also try to do more of, and that is also low bureaucracy, which makes it easy for us to do on a small level. But then when you're small, it's also harder to resist like the kind of the pressure from partners to tweak things here and tweak things there, because they have a certain budget, and if you're small and you really need that contract with them, and they don't want to call it sexual harassment, they want to call it bullying or discrimination, then you're in a harder position when you're small. So the private sector partnerships for us are a little complicated like that too, because of the kind of controversial nature of the work we do, I guess. So this is I expect it might be a little bit different for people working in a different field than us, but for us these were kind of the challenges of different funding sources.
Thanks, Rebecca. I'm really curious to hear other reflections on this question here of how size affects sort of financing strategies and funding. But there's a couple of other questions I also want to cover before we wrap up. So if I can just encourage you to perhaps also share a couple of lines in the chat, that would be greatly appreciated. Geshe has another question, and she's asking specifically you, Gabriella, but I'll actually also open it up. She's asking whether there's a difference between civic tech and commercial startups. And I think that's a really, really interesting question. Nelson, you already shared with us some of your experiences and thinking around actually diversifying your revenues and trying to sell commercially solutions, products to other NGOs. But so my question is then like, what's then the difference between this civic tech organizations and I suppose social businesses, to borrow a term from the Bangladeshi economist Muhammad Yunus, this idea that a corporate entity, a commercial entity, can actually generate revenue that can subsidize nonprofit activities. So where do we draw the line? Where does nonprofit end and where does social enterprise begin? Maybe it's getting a little bit theoretical and academic, but I hope you follow my point here. Nelson, perhaps I can start with you since you shared some experiences from Nigeria.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Basically, I believe that civic tech and or probably commercial organizations and social impact organizations, one major clear cut difference is this level of social impact that both look at. So, for example, an organization that is civic tech, but that is looking at generating income will be looking at, okay, beyond this income generate that I'm going to generate, what is the impact that I am creating? And that's critical to their objective, to their goal, and doing something differently. Whereas the commercial organization is more pretty focused on how do we make our board, our investors happy. And I've had and I've had to work in both space. I've had to take trainings in both space because you've you you need to borrow lessons, you need to borrow best practices in both to create um a, a a 21st century organization, because people are now looking beyond profit. So look at the context of climate change. Most organizations now, most companies now are, are more or less paying attention to their carbon footprint. So take for example motors, the vehicle industry. Most of them are paying attention to their carbon footprint. Manufacturing industries they're paying attention to their carbon footprint. So because people are now so educated that they would demand, why are you doing things this way that hurts or that puts a lot of carbon footprint on planet Earth? So that's the way the new 21st century organization businesses are being run. But beyond that, if you are focused on the social impact space, many of us are more like, we are less inclined towards the revenue. We want to be sustainable. We want to ensure that we are able to pay and meet our and meet our expenditures, but we are also far more interested in the what should I call it now, in the impact. So for example, I worked on a platform recently called Sojari, and what it was to do is to help in the battle against cyber crime. And so the platform was a cyber security platform. It was working to the angle is to fix phishing. So there is a lot of phishing going on, and is expected to increase to by 2025 is expected to increase to 10.5 trillion globally, and money that has been lost to fishing. As at now, is around half of that. And what I was trying to do is, how can I ensure that people pay for these services, whereas um, we are able to ensure sustainability of the platform. And in the whole strategy, I realized that majority of the people that are willing to pay for cybersecurity are even corporate agencies and not individuals. Individuals are less motivated, they can take those risks, whereas corporate agencies are they are more they are more demanded by the regulations, by different privacy laws and all those things. They are motivated by that to not allow their system to be breached. And the essence of this is that, so while you are doing your customer research and you are targeting the corporate organization, how can you ensure that you're still able to drive that impact you want to do. So you could say, like, for every organization you are able to onboard, you are bringing in, you are providing a subsidized or a free 10 onboarding 10 persons that are vulnerable on your platform as well. You are providing them free access to your platform. So they are not going to pay. So probably the elderly or all those vulnerable target group are not going to pay, so that you are able to meet the goals of revenue, but you are also able to meet the goal of trying to um, fix that social impact you're working on. But beyond that, sometimes you are very lucky. You are very lucky that both are able to align on the same platform. There is one platform that we are also working on. Is a due diligence platform in Nigeria that ensures that you are not victims of land scam and land fraud. And what we are trying to do with that is that if you want to procure a land, you are able to do due diligence through our platform. You pay through the platform. The platform is helping you to achieve the fact that you are not a victim of land fraud. But of course, a person that is trying to procure land is also he has few money to spare, and he could pay a little bit for to perform due diligence and ensure that at least that platform keeps running. The people that are feeding in the data into the platform are being paid. The people that are managing the software end of the platform are being also paid, and all those ends. So sometimes we are able to get that um, um, both goals to align on
Yeah.
in the same project. Yeah.
Thanks, Nelson. I hijacked the question and redirected it to Nelson, Gabriella, but it was actually addressed to you. I don't know if you have some thoughts, if you could keep it brief here, because we need to wrap up also.
Yeah, I can try and keep it brief. I mean, I think the differences also between like social entrepreneurships and whatever. I suppose my main takeaway is, I'm not an advocate necessarily for purely, social entrepreneurship models. What I don't like is that, I think young startups aren't being presented with these models as an option. And I think there are, it really depends on what your organizational aims are. As an organization, my organization, my funding model is based on my organizational needs. That's how I decide which way I need to go. And part of my foundational belief is that I need a team of employees who have security, in order to produce the kinds of game changing technologies that we have. And so that means that I have to form a strategy because, like we were saying, your size and your continuity matters. And you need to be designing your funding strategy for the organization you want. Not just in response to, how do I get stuff in the door today, but in 3 years' time, 4 years' time, 5 years' time, what is the kind of work we want to be doing? And that needs to influence your model. I mean, some of the more traditional social entrepreneurships that come out, part of the problem is that often beneficiaries become the business model. That's difficult um, to stomach in certain cases. But again, you need to think about your direct organizational needs and work around that. And just those options being immediately closed to young South African startups in particular, I think is dangerous.
Thanks for that, Gabriella. I want to give you, each one of you, I was going to say 1 minute, but perhaps more like 45 seconds for your closing remarks here. And I'm actually going to pick up on a question that was that was asked by Melissa. As civic tech innovators, what do you think the ideal funding for civic tech should be? So I'll give you 45 seconds each to just share some thoughts on that or to answer that question. And I'll start in reverse order. So that means, Caroline, if you could go first.
How do you my
Caroline, we can't hear you. Try again.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, Tveg, speak up. Should be fine.
Okay, I'm struggling a lot with my sound. I don't know why this has not happened before. Um, so just to summarize my discussions and also what has been discussed here is um, the civic tech for us is basically we're using it to reinforce openness and transparency in government and also in local constituencies, and also we are looking to improve civic engagement. And my plea or my call for partnerships with my colleagues here and others who are listening will be to try and leverage on some of the areas that donors are looking into. For example, they are looking into areas of on funding on how can we improve on gendered corruption in terms of use of ICT for development and good governance, or how can we ensure that the marginalized communities are also using the ICT platforms for transparency and accountability matters. So those are some of the areas that I'm keen to look into. And if there's anyone interested in such conversations, I'll be happy to discuss that and more. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Caroline. Nelson, you're next. 45 seconds. What should the ideal funding, the civic tech funding structure, what should it look like?
I think we should focus on a mixture of both, more of grants and looking at how organizations can also generate income to be sustainable. Um, it's obvious over time that grant is not um, a sustainable model that we can rely on for a long time. Even the donors will tell you that their attentions change. So I think a mixture of both, looking internally at how you could generate income to sustain your organization, while also looking at how you could get in those grants to at least do the big stuff. This mixture would definitely help in ensuring that, of course, there is a backup always. And yeah, I think that'll be it.
Thanks, Nelson. A mixture of both. I like that. Profit and non-profit combined. Rebecca, you next. I suppose ideal is not something you worry about. Any funding will do right now, given your
Right now,
situation.
anything.
But 45 seconds.
Okay. Yeah, so I agree that a mix is best. It's most sustainable when things change. Our favorite, kind of over all the different changes that we've been through, has been multi-year core support grants from foundations, ideally with partners that we have a trusting relationship with and don't have a lot of requirements and bureaucratically. Um, but something that we also love is in-kind funding, where partners, whoever they are, individuals, uh, companies, the people we're working with, donors, whoever, those people cover the costs directly. So if we're having a training or an event in a neighborhood or something, someone else pays for everything directly, and the money doesn't come through us. So the foundation grants are great for covering our basic needs like staff salaries and rent and the stuff that needs to keep going. But for projects, it's great if we don't even have to touch the money.
Thanks for that, Rebecca. Gabriella, last but not least.
Yeah, I think, the more diverse the funding, the less likely the master, so diversified funding also has a political benefit. And I do think, there's often a discussion about the agendas of private sector funders, but I caution against the agendas of both development and philanthropic funders as well. And I still, in my conspiracist heart, believe that a lot of your more social, high impact social change work will probably come from those surplus funds you've managed to develop unbeholden to do the kinds of true transformative work you want to do. So your funding strategy has to not be an administrative strategy. It has to be a social organizational strategy as well. And I think it really does need to tie in with what your long-term social change agenda is. And you need to be very conscious about that in your design.
Thanks for that, Gabriela. I'm afraid we're out of time. Before we wrap up, I just want to advertise some of the other exciting sessions that are on the program today. So now at 11:30, that's now, we have the second Civic Tech Deep Dive, which will have a presentation of the African Union Civic Tech Fund, Civic Tech Initiatives. And then at 2 this afternoon, 2 CAT, we have a funders roundtable focusing on the funding and support environment for African information ecosystems. It's a roundtable discussion, and I would really encourage you to participate in that. It'll give you an opportunity to actually speak to some of the people and listen to some of the people on the other side of the table. That's it from me. Thank you to the panelists, Gabriela Razzano, Rebecca Chow, Nelson Olanipekun, and Caroline Yathi. Thanks to the organizers, the Civic Tech Innovation Forum, JamFest, WITS Journalism, and WITS School of Governance. And last but not least, thanks to all of you for participating and for contributing to the discussions. I believe we'll be closing the session with another song from Melo Mino, and I will see you at the next session. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to a space of African innovation and creativity. This is my beautifully talented band, and my name is Melo Mino. And we hope you can jam with us today and share the spirit of Civic Tech Innovation and JamFest. Let's go.